we're going closer to the White House, we're across the Treasury. Yeah, I don't remember what.
115?
Yeah, I think that's. I don't remember exact address. We're not moving for a few months, so I'll have more time for BTC. But yeah, it's not. It's just so easy to do this because it's literally a stone's throw away. But yeah, no, the other office is required. Yeah, Milken. Michael Milken bought buildings because he's like, I could just buy Tiltines. Yeah, that's the thing with this funding, like sort of increased funding and also build transit will help older markets and even the ones that are not, or will definitely help those that are more affluent, but that will help, I don't know, because if they don't have to go as far, it's just better. Or I know there's, what about you? What have you doing? Well, yeah, I went to school right by Detroit, and it was very automobile dependent there. Yeah. Motor City, of course.
So are you primarily going to be in New York then?
Yeah.
I've been going back and forth a lot, so I've been going up and down.
Yes, it had just been built, but honestly, Detroit is a huge city. And the streets aren't getting it. Like you almost have to go on the highway in order to get to certain parts of the city. And I don't know how they have to almost yeah, absolutely. I would just
sleeping in my cell, in my house by myself. You know, sleeping inside. I opened my cell. So I got attacked that way. You know, it's like, they should do something. They should be off.
RTA, the RTA, everyone was so and it was primarily like 2 counties that put it down. I don't remember why, but it was the taxing or something like that. It was going to raise taxes up. And 2 counties, which counties it was, put it down, so every other county said yes. Everyone had to say yes. Yeah, it was so, if that happened while I was like,
send a message. That was the ultimate. They were going to hire their own, but I wasn't going to step up.
Yes. It would have helped so much with.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right, sorry. No, it's okay. All right, hello everyone. Sorry we're a few minutes late. I just want to welcome you all to the Bipartisan Policy Center and the first day of spring. I'm glad we could get you all here before basketball madness kicks in tomorrow, although UConn is not in it. So, but anyway, thank you all for being here, and welcome to our viewers online. We have quite a few web viewers watching. You can also find us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. So today is kind of an exciting day. We have an amazing lineup of wonderful speakers with a dearth of experience, a wide range of experience, and we're kind of merging 2 projects a little bit. We have this Executive Council on Infrastructure, which we've had for a number of years, which has largely been focused on the question of how do we get that trillions of dollars of investment that's sitting on the sidelines of American infrastructure, that's heavily involved in European infrastructure, how do we get that into American projects? And so that effort has been led by Susan Story from American Water and Doug Peterson from S&P, who is here today. And I got to tell you, he has been a wonderful champion for both BPC and this project, and been really diligent in pushing the message that P3s are part of the solution. They're not the entire solution, which of course is why we've launched our Great American Rebuild Initiative, which we're here to discuss today. And we are thrilled to have 2 former members of Congress, Representatives Bill Schuster and Joe Crowley, here to do that for us, to look at that revenue piece and how we solve the federal funding issue. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who's going to talk a little bit about the work of the council, and then we'll start our panel. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us today at the Bipartisan Policy Center and discuss infrastructure, which is one of the most important issues facing the country. And I want to talk to you about a few of those statistics. And one of the largest challenges is funding, and it's financial. And I'm not sure that anyone in this room would be surprised to hear that there's $3.3 trillion in infrastructure investment needed over the next decade. And meanwhile, as this is going on, congestion and traffic jams, and we had an earlier meeting here today that a couple of people were late because of congestion and traffic jams. Last year in 2018, this was all measured, and the average American lost 97 hours stuck in traffic. And that, if you actually calculate that and put it into financial terms, that's about $87 billion or $1,400 per driver. Maybe that's where we can get the money to pay for the gas tax. But there's other areas of infrastructure as well. Let's talk about water. Last year, 2 trillion gallons of treated water were lost through leaking pipes. And that's almost 6 billion gallons of water every day. It's costly, it's inefficient, and can you imagine that water system is losing 16% of its water to leakage? It's the #1 usage of water in the United States is leaks. And we've heard about these kind of challenges before. Infrastructure is been talked about. We see bipartisan interest in infrastructure, but we haven't been seeing the kind of action, and we've seen plans, but they have not been approved. But there are opportunities and things we can talk about. I've been co-chairing the BPC's Executive Council on Infrastructure, a group of about a dozen corporate executives from many different industries, and we've been finding bipartisan solutions to push for action to modernize our infrastructure systems. At S&P Global, ourselves, we've been seeing that the growing pressure on governments' budgets at every level around the globe, not just in the United States. And we must look beyond just the traditional public sector ways of financing infrastructure for roads, for bridges, for ports, for airports, for networks. And as we talked about in some other meetings, there's also interest in social infrastructure as well. We've seen here and around the world private sector investors stepping in either directly in different types of projects or through public-private partnerships. In 2016, the council that I work with here at BPC released a report on a new model to leverage private capital and begin the work of closing that investment gap. If you look at the findings from that report, and we initiated some of these different ideas, we think that we could unlock at least an additional $250 billion over the next 5 years in private capital for infrastructure projects. And I said at least, it's probably much more. But there's a lot also going on in innovation, in expertise, in capital, in planning, in design, and other ways to think about infrastructure. The private sector does have a responsibility to take infrastructure investment needs seriously and need to be part of this dialogue. And if you look at some of the new developments going on in infrastructure, if you think about the way roads are designed, or 5G, or the Internet of Things, the IoT, so to speak, and how connected and autonomous vehicles are going to be common soon, this is another reason we have to be talking about infrastructure now. But if you look at the way governments, and in particular municipalities, states, have been financing infrastructure, they've been looking at it as a way that it's a procurement, not an investment. There's a cycle of deferred maintenance, project backlogs. You see it when you drive the roads in almost any city. I live in New York. You see it at the airports. We believe that now it's a very unique time for Congress to look as bipartisan opportunities to address infrastructure. And that's what we're here today to discuss. While the Executive Council has been focusing on public-private partnerships, Congress also needs to look at what will be the position of the public sector related to this. And for public-private partnerships to thrive, we also need the public side of this to come up with ways to provide funding. So I'm pleased here today to be part of the launch of a new initiative to look at funding for the Highway Trust Fund. The trust fund needs to be modernized, and once again, as we know in the past, it's going to run out of funds in 2021 unless Congress acts, and we don't want to see that again. Combining BPC's reputation for thoughtful, bipartisan policy solutions with the expertise and political know-how of our former Representatives Schuster and Crowley, I'm sure it's a way that we can put together some solutions that will really be realizable. With that, I want to invite Michelle back up, and she's going to announce the panel, and we're going to be looking forward to a very lively discussion this morning. And thank you for joining us.
Nice.
Man, I got a joke to start with. This is the first time you're going to see Joe Crowley to the right of me.
I'm the setup.
And the last time you'll see Bill Schuster to the left of him.
It's a setup.
Well, I'm sure everyone knows them, but in case someone for some reason doesn't, Bill Schuster was a representative for Pennsylvania's 9th District from 2001 to 2019. He was chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and a member of the Armed Services Committee. And Joe Crowley was the representative from the New York's 14th District from 1999 to 2019. He was chair of the Democratic Caucus during the 115th Congress and, most importantly, was a member of the Ways and Means Committee, which is going to be responsible for paying for whatever we can all agree to do. So, first, thank you so much for being here with us. We are thrilled to announce this initiative. So let's just dive in. So, infrastructure seems to be the topic that everyone can agree needs to be addressed. You had, the president has obviously made it a big focus of his, well, it was part of the campaign. He mentioned it at the State of the Union. He did mention it this year briefly in the State of the Union. And then you had, right after the election with a divided government, you had Majority Leader McConnell say infrastructure was an area for bipartisanship. Speaker Pelosi said it was an area for potential agreement. And so we seem to have some consensus that this is something we can do. So what it's going to take to get this over the line? Can it be done?
I believe it can be done, but the first thing that has to happen is the President of the United States has to be pounding this message every single day. And that's the way the American people, it goes to a level that everybody understands it. If the president's talking about it, and I said that to the president when I was there, until he does that, there's 535 voices out there with different, but he's one voice. He can get the TV cameras to focus, and he ought to mention it. I wish he would have said more in the State of the Union. I think it was 2 lines. But he has to make it a central part. He has to be pounding on the table, talking about it every day, and I think that helps everybody move in the right direction. Although there'll be some people that will move in the other direction if he's talking about it every day, but it's still, the American people will be talking about it.
But you both have said, Peter DeFazio, chairman of the House T&I committee, you'd mentioned earlier, has been there 30 years waiting for his opportunity to run that committee, has it, and has really made every indication that he's going to move a bill.
And I believe, based on his 30 years there, this has been his focus. And my last 4 years' experience with Peter is Peter knows how to cut a deal. He knows he's not going to get everything he wants, but I think he's willing to sit at the table and say, let's move something.
So, Congressman Crowley, if the president does come out forcefully for an infrastructure bill, Democrats going to want to give him one?
Well, as a child, I was growing up. My mother said, if you can't tweet something nice about someone, don't tweet anything at all. And I think Bill's, it's a good point that he brings out in terms of, I think the leadership has to come from the top. And it's been a struggle, I think, in a lot of respects, to see that kind of focus and attention when everything else kind of gets distorted by everything else that's going on politically around. I do think that Pete DeFazio would like to see something move. It's, I think it's the dream of any chairman to have the bill of a career happen, so to speak. The capping off of a career. And Bill's dad, Bud Schuster, had a number of those opportunities when he was the chair of the Transportation Committee in the House. But I do, and it's aside from the personal, glory that comes from that. It really is, as I've been talking about. I was a member of the Semi-Quincentennial Commission. Does anyone know what that is? The Semi-Quincentennial Commission? No. Bill knows because I've been talking to him about it. You all remember the Bicentennial Commission, right? No. You and I, we remember the Bicentennial Commission. Most of these young folks here don't remember that at all. But that was a celebration of the 200th anniversary of the United States. And here we are going to be celebrating our 250th. The Semi-Quincentennial is a 250th anniversary celebration. Ought we not have an infrastructure that is reflective of a nation that is a democracy that is 250 years old as a goal? So I do think there are rallying cries by which Democrats and Republicans really need to come together to find the solutions. As I said earlier, it's easy to find the problems. It's really finding the solutions can be much more difficult. But that's not to say that some of these issues aren't difficult things to grapple with. When I talk about the Green New Deal, for instance, show an idea of increasing the gas tax, which is something that would be positive because maybe less people will drive if the gas tax goes up in some respects. But at the same time, if you look at electric vehicles, and they're also using the road, and the economic disparity between those who can afford those and those who can't, what responsibility is there to kind of capture their responsibility towards maintenance of roads, tunnels, and bridges? And I think also then it gets to the larger picture as well. It's not, sorry, Billy, it's not just roads, tunnels, and bridges for Democrats. It is about schools. It is about hospitals. It is about broadband access and build out that Speaker Pelosi and Peter and others have been talking about as well. So it's really, what are we actually talking about? Is it, simply, not simply, because it's not easy either, just roads, tunnels, and bridges, or is it a much bigger package that we're looking at?
Well, I think that's a good point, because our focus today is obviously on the Highway Trust Fund and maintaining and enabling that to carry us into the future. But as you point out, and BPC's Executive Council, we've been very focused on water infrastructure, which does not have its own trust fund. It is subject to annual appropriations, which fluctuate from year to year and make it a little bit difficult for states to plan. And of course, the next Flint crisis is probably right around the corner. Broadband comes up in every meeting we've ever done on the Hill. People want to talk about rural broadband. It is the big divider. And so those are issues that are critically important that we are continuing to focus on. They don't have their own funding stream, though. And in this context, it's kind of hard to see how they could get one when we can't even maintain the trust fund that we have. But along those lines, and how you pay for this, and whether it is gas tax or tolls, I mean, construction on roads is not free, and I think that's part of the message that we're hoping to get out over the next couple of months. But Representative Schuster, so when you, right before you left, you introduced or offered a bill kind of outlining what you think needed to be done. It included the gas tax. You've probably had a lot of conversations with your former colleagues on this. Do you think can we get a gas tax out of a Republican Senate anyway?
I think there are a couple of dozen Republican members that I'm fairly confident would vote for it. In fact, I use Lloyd Schmucker as an example. He was in the state Senate of Pennsylvania, Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican Governor. He voted for it. He ran for Congress. They beat him up twice about that vote running for Congress. He's still a member of Congress, so he understands. So there's members out there who will do that. And I've heard others, very conservative members, say they would support it because as a conservative, it's a principle that if you use a system, you ought to pay for the system. So it's right up our alley if you're talking about how we fund this in a way that we should be able to, as Republicans, as conservatives, accept. So as Joe said, it's going to be a challenge. I know a lot of folks say, well, let's just toll the interstate highway system, and my response has always been, you think raising the gas tax is hard? Go take Route 81 that runs through my district, my old district of Pennsylvania, and tell a 56-year-old man or woman they're going to pay a toll now. They've been thinking they've been using it for 40 years for free. Then the pitchforks and the axe handles come out after the members of Congress. Because they're not going to pay for that. They feel they've already paid for it, and they have. So user fee is a midterm fix to it, but there has to be something down the road, and there's a lot of ideas out there, but I think a mileage-based user fee is something that is what should be with technology, but we've got to deal with the privacy issues.
And you, Congressman Crowley, you sort of alluded to this earlier with the Green New Deal, and obviously the Democrats are very, climate has taken on a new high-level profile. Can you do infrastructure and still be climate responsive to the climate change issues? I mean, I think there's things that can be done in an infrastructure bill that address climate without sort of beating the Republicans over the head with it.
Just to go back, it's not a new issue for Democrats.
No.
So they've been, as Nancy Pelosi would say, she's been fighting these issues before a lot of people were born in the Democratic caucus today. So, but I do think the emphasis is certainly much greater. I think there are going to be some of those dichotomies that exist as well in terms of trying to find the solutions, and at the same time, it may not jive with everything that's being said in the short-term goals or long-term goals, depending on how you look at it, 12 years or beyond. Elimination of carbon, period, would mean that ultimately there'd be no gas tax that's viable because there'll be no gas vehicles. Theoretically. So, that's when I'm talking about the gas tax and the increase. it's also about a fairness issue, about how and who pays for that. So, for instance, if you are wealthy enough to own a electric vehicle, you're not contributing anymore towards the maintenance of roads, tunnels, and bridges through the gas tax. You're not using that. How do we make that a fairer system? At the same time, not discourage investment in electric vehicles or non-carbon vehicles. So there's going to be a little bit. There's some challenges here for Democrats, I think, to figure it out. Not insurmountable, but just some challenges we have to figure out from an ideological point of view as well.
But I think that raises a good point, because even to extend the gas tax, you do raise a lot of those issues. And talking to a lot of Republican offices, they say, well, you know, the transit centers aren't contributing to it, and yet they're getting, we spend, you know this better than I do, how much percent of the gas tax actually goes, 20% goes to transit. And so it you know, brings to mind, obviously, a lot of those rural-urban issues that are really much harder than the partisan issues are to deal with. So how do we address that? What advice do you give to the guys trying to address this now?
It's not only advice, but it's the facts. And the facts are, I'm from a rural district. Rural America gets about $1.70 for every dollar they put into the trust fund back. So it's a pretty good deal for rural America. And we complain about, rural places complain about transit, but you know, the logic of it is if you're putting people in transit, they're coming off the roads. So there is a plus there. Now, in the draft discussion, I did say transit ought to contribute some, because it'll lessen the argument that they're not contributing for those folks that come from my part of the party or the world. But I think it's the facts bear out that rural America benefits by it. You're not going to have an interstate highway running from the east of Pennsylvania to the west of Pennsylvania, 80 across the northern tier. There's no population up there, but yet they've got a highway, and there's people that are there and industries that are growing up around it.
Yeah, I think it's because it is an interesting point too. Is that, well, they're going to have to redo a formula, which is always a struggle, and then this balance about who is paying into it, and how do we broaden that. You're going to have to broaden it out if we're going to sustain this over the long run. And I'm curious too if you have thoughts on how long. So at some point the fleet turns over to predominantly electric. Do we have any sense for when that happens? I think
we're projecting about a third of the fleet is electric or non-carbon by 2040. I think that's kind of the number. So it's, you know. So we've got 20-some years before we need to have it's moving quickly.
Yeah, something in place by then, right. Which is going to take socializing, and as you mentioned, there's privacy issues associated with doing that. We have some work being done here at BPC on the privacy, the data space. Not an easy one to fix, but there's some states who are experimenting with it.
Right. And there's some folks out there that say, well, let's just collect it. You know, each taxpayer pays a fee for their car, but you take it from 1,100 places basically that are collecting the tax. So it's very efficient the way we do it today. And if you change it over to that, you got 300 million people. We have to say, did Crowley pay its tax? Did Schuster do his? So keeping it based at the pump or the technology, it's very efficient, and it's really kind of painless. Well, I should ask this. I got this from Ed Rendell. How many people in here know, and Bertram, you can't raise your hand, how many people know what the federal gas tax is? That's maybe a third of the room. I won't ask you what it is, but it's 18.4 cents. But I've now asked a lot of rooms that question, not all people that are really into infrastructure. People don't know what they're paying at the gas tax, and they say, we're going to double the gas tax, and everybody rears back and goes, oh my God, that's 15 cents, 18 cents if you double it. That's not a lot of money to the average American he's going to pay to improve and reduce the congestion and improve the roads. So again, it's something I think is doable, but we have to present it in the right way to the American people.
So in the past, so even with FAST Act, you were on Ways and Means at the time. They, you know, it's rumored they, you know, had to dig into the couch cushions to find a few cents to pay for that bill because they did not extend the gas tax.
We had to sell the couch last time, so it's gone.
So what's left?
That is the challenge, I think, is what mechanisms that can we do in a bipartisan way, quite frankly, if that's doable. You know, there are within sectors, you know, is it the doubling of the passenger maintenance facility fee? Is it the, you know, what do we do with the harbor maintenance in terms of ports and airports? because again, looking at the much broader picture of infrastructure, it's not, again, not just, right? Not just. It's big enough in tunnels, roads, and bridges, but there are other aspects. And I look at, you know, the needs are incredible. I look at New York City alone, and we have multiple challenges, not only, you know, in terms of, you see what's happening in terms of airport construction, bridge construction, et cetera, and some really positive things happening. We have an older infrastructure, both tunnels, roads, and bridges, and mass transit. So there's competition, and not necessarily with Billy per se, because I think he gets it, but, you know, dealing with more rural versus urban areas, more modern urban areas versus more older, like Boston, New York, well, the needs are different. And modernization, especially after Sandy, we saw what the impact was there. So when those tolls go up in the New York City region, they're primarily going towards MTA to maintain, and even there are incredible challenges in a city like New York, where you've all been reading about as well over the past few years, and who's in control, the city, the state, what role is the federal government going to play towards maintenance of those? Because I think Bill is right. It's keeping more people off the road. If the LIRR goes down, you know, people get back on the road, and the LIE gets backed up, and makes the livability of a place like New York much more difficult.
Well, we've seen a little bit of that around here with some of the struggles our metro system has had. I think it has forced more people to drive in, making all of our commutes a little more miserable. It would be nice to get them all back on the transit system, but that sort of goes to the bigger issue that's unspoken in all this is the deferred maintenance, that we're not maintaining these assets as we need to be.
That's one of the reasons I think the private sector has to play a bigger role, because in the private, as a former business owner, you invest in your physical plant. If the roof's leaking, you need to fix it, because if you don't fix it, it's going to cave in. And that's exactly what we see here at Metro. They've deferred this maintenance to the point now where there's accidents, there's shutdowns, and that's why the private sector, if they get on board, they understand they've got to keep this efficient. They need it to be efficient, so they're going to invest the money to keep updating it. And government has a problem. All governments at all levels say, well, let's push it off till next year, and then it's 5 years down the road. Then it's a serious problem that takes a lot more money to fix.
Well, that's one of the things we've worked with S&P and others about, is that in order to get the private capital in there, you do need that assessment of the condition of a road or an asset, and you need a life cycle cost analysis. And you had mentioned Sandy. I think through that life cycle cost analysis, you're sort of forced to look at the impact of the storms and the potential for natural disasters, and the way that might drive up your cost in 20 years when that road gets flooded or the bridge comes down in a storm. And so that would enable the private sector to be able to find the projects to invest in.
Well, the infrastructure needs, again, coming back to my hometown of New York, infrastructure needs based on, you know, the accepted notion of global warming by not everyone, but most people, that, you know, to build up now structures that will help prevent that flooding, like the East River when it comes into the Harlem River Drive, or the East FDR Drive, as just one example. So that infrastructure, the redundancy or the preparation for that, the investment that the Governor Cuomo wanted to make after Sandy in helping to prevent those from happening again, and the friction of the difficulty in doing that was palpable. Can I also just say, in terms of the president and the private-public partnership, there's got to be a clearer statement as well, because, you know, we heard what happened with Pence and Indiana, and what came out afterwards. It kind of, where are they? Where was the president on that? And do I think there's a role for public-private partnership? Yes. I think maybe more limited. I think Democrats would look at it. It's a bigger sell, a tougher sell to Democrats, maybe, I think. But I do think there's a role. I think there's some.
It's not the complete answer.
Yeah.
Right.
You don't want to have debt for everything you do. You have to have cash in the deal to make it work, and so we've got to figure out a way to fund that, not just with the private dollars, but with public dollars.
Well, I will say, since I have the opportunity, the Indiana Toll Road was actually a success for the taxpayers of the state of Indiana, who didn't incur any of when the company went bankrupt. It was the company that had.
Well, if I can just jump on that.
Feel free.
The Indiana Toll Road is a perfect example. Even though it failed once, they got $3.8 billion for it in 2007, and I got Governor Daniels to come in and meet with me after they'd done the deal, and he said, we figured it was worth about $2.8 billion, and when they said $3.8 billion, he said, I couldn't sign the papers fast enough to get the money. So what they did was most of it went, they paid off the debt on the roadway, they invested in infrastructure, they put a maintenance fee, $500 million of maintenance fee to help that. But then they overpaid for it, so it went bankrupt in 2014-15. They released it, and they got another $1 billion for it. So everybody thinks if you lease an asset, and I don't say sell assets, lease them, it doesn't go away. They didn't shut the Indiana Toll Road down. It kept operating, and then they brought another company in to get it on 20 cents on the dollar, whatever it was, and the taxpayers of Indiana benefited again from it. So it's a great example of asset recycling. That's what it is. And I think it can be done in a lot of different places. And 40 years from now, when they turn it back to Indiana, they'll probably redo a lease. And it'll be because the private sector is going to make sure they invest the dollars to keep it an efficient operating system.
Make another point, because he
Sure.
mentioned Ed Riddell earlier. And I've had multiple conversations with him, even about the tolling issue for the right of Pennsylvania to toll the federal highways through the state, because they have to maintain them, they have to plow them, and they don't get that reimbursement. So you do have, as much as citizens don't want to have those tolls, there are entities within the states themselves that recognize the cost to the state and to the citizens in other ways, through taxes and through state taxes. Who pays for that? The salting, who pays for the plowing, who pays for all those things? The state does. And so even putting aside the public-private partnership notion of tolling of highways, states themselves would like to be able to step in and do some of that, if nothing else.
That's a really good point, because again, you have to pay for it somehow, whether you're tolling it or it's a gas tax or however you want to do it. Somebody has to pay for that. So, but I would be remiss, since I've got two former members of Congress here. We have divided government. Yes, we have divided government again, which many think we can be more productive in a divided government. Do you have some recommendations for your colleagues who are now dealing with a whole new world than they were, say?
You're in the minority. I'm in the majority.
Yeah, I think that the notion or idea of having a period or time when there's less politics there was a time, I think, when we weren't constantly running for office, and now we're constantly 24/7 running for office. The social media aspects of it that have really changed the dynamics of politics, generally speaking. That the presidential cycle is in 2020, but it's already started, and we have anticipate over 20 Democrats running for president right now, and the president himself is focused on 2020. We see that in the tweets that were put out. So that's already started. The question really will be, I think, what is that point in period where it's over? You stop working because you're going to focus. No side is going to want to give the other side, so to speak, the advantage moving into the election cycle. I think the August break is one, and then maybe some time in September. But the closer you get to next year and the primaries start, it gets more and more difficult, I think.
And that's something also that I think it's possible. Joe said the time frame, but now Republicans and Democrats, it's the primary you have to worry about, some of us. I went through two really tough primaries. Somebody far to my right, said I was a liberal. But you have to go through this process now where it's not just Democrats and Republicans at each other, it's Democrats at Democrats and Republicans at Republicans. So the election cycle has even expanded even further.
Well, on that positive note, but no, since we are, since we have it's a limited time window. So we are going to hit the ground running with our initiative, and you can follow us on BPC's website or Twitter. We're going to do some polling and try and do some really interactive public-facing pieces of this to get the word out that we need some new revenue sources on the table if we're going to solve this problem in the long term. So with that, I do want to, sorry, I forgot. I'm supposed to open it up to audience questions now. Sorry. Do we have microphones going around, or okay? How about right here in the up front?
Hi, my name is Maxine. I'm a reporter for E&E News, and my question was, Are you optimistic about the prospects of moving a broad infrastructure package as opposed to simply reauthorizing the FAST Act or moving some smaller bills?
Well, I think the House could potentially move a much broader bill, and the Senate will do a much narrower bill. But when it goes to conference, you know, as Joe mentioned, Republicans are, if they want to get an infrastructure bill, they're going to have to take some of the things that traditionally the Senate doesn't want to put in a bill. So get it off the House floor, get it off the Senate floor, and then let's get to conference and try to do something that it'll be, I believe it'll be broader than that.
I think that recognizing the trust fund needs some replenishment by 2021, and the Congress has been working on a deadline basis. Yeah. You know, the fiscal cliff after fiscal cliff after fiscal cliff, that's become the norm, something I decried. It wouldn't it be nice, with all that's going on in the world, natural and man-made disasters, that the government of the United States could actually work in a more thoughtful way. But I do think, you know, I have to recognize the political reality of it as well. I do think that from the Democratic side, you have multiple jurisdictions just for the committee structures themselves. You'll have T&I, you'll have energy, transportation infrastructure, energy and commerce, education, energy and commerce, educational workforce. The Financial Services Committee will have some of these certainly ways and means in terms of the pay for. So I do think you're going to see that. I think Bill's right. We'll have a broader, potentially a broader bill ultimately together than the Senate. And again, you know, the politics will come into play at this at some point as well, sooner rather than later, I think, just given the nature of the political calendar. So.
Yeah, right there. Thank you.
Hi. I think we can probably all agree that it should, if we're going to do a VMT or a road user charge, it should cost more to drive in like downtown Manhattan at rush hour than on a rural highway in Wyoming. So I was thinking a local congestion pricing project could probably allow local communities, cities, regions to do that kind of work. Do you think that should be incorporated into, like, does the federal government have a role in supporting those kind of actions?
I don't believe so. I think that's something that has to be, those jurisdictions have to decide that. We saw what's happened here in Virginia. 395 seems to be working pretty well. I-66, when there's tolls $40, what's happened, I've been told, is people are getting off the main roads now and they're clogging Georgetown up because they don't want to pay those high tolls. So I really think it's best left to the local jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, to figure out how they're going to do it. Because I guarantee if we do it on the federal level, it'll be a disaster. Because we'll do one size fits all, and it just won't work. What's good for New York is not good for Phoenix, for instance.
I don't know if there's a way to incentivize it. There may very well be a way in which, because I think New York itself, both from the city's aspect and the state, are looking at these issues. Certainly Governor Cuomo, they may not be identical. There are a couple of bills that are floating out there. I supported years ago the Bloomberg 2030 plan, which was not just about planting 1 million new trees. There was other aspects, and congestive pricing was a big part of that. And it wasn't every aspect that I was thrilled about. And 70% of my district was actually polled in opposition to it. But I recognized then, I recognize today, that a city like New York is becoming more unlivable. And there are a lot of aspects to that, reasons for that. But it does take some bold action. I thought Bloomberg was right. I've been a little bit more resistant in terms of the newer plans. One of the things that I felt was that there needs to be a way for someone to get from Long Island to New Jersey and bypass the city and be rewarded necessarily not going through it. We're getting too into the weeds in terms of local government. But I do think there's a path forward there. I think there is a way that it was, it's not just about opening new parks and having a greener New York. It's about making it more livable. And a big chunk of that was congestive pricing. And I think it's certainly gaining steam in the state legislature, and certainly the governor is supportive of some type of that. So again, I don't know if it's transferable to a region like this. I think it depends on how it's made up. Manhattan is an island unto itself, so the entrance is more restrictive just by that aspect of it,
Behind her and the gentleman, yep. And then we'll go over here.
Hi, Steve Nadell with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Comment and a question. The comment has to do with electric vehicles. Representative Crowley, you are correct that the average EV purchaser is wealthier than the average citizen, but only slightly wealthier than the average new vehicle purchaser. People who buy new vehicles are wealthier. That said, do we need to do more about encouraging people with used EVs? Likewise, is there more to do in rural areas about charging? How do we address pickup trucks, for example, which are disproportionately purchased in rural areas? So yes, there's a little something, but we can work with it. My question has to do with the VMT charge, and I'm wondering whether there's any chance that Congress might gradually phase something in, set a deadline for the Department of Transportation to decide on the mechanism, give X number of years later before the manufacturers have to build in the appropriate equipment, X number of years later. So you're talking 2030, but would that then make it easier to backfill a gas tax knowing that it was only temporary?
When you have a bureaucracy trying to manage something like that, I don't think it is efficient. I think that, again, as Joe mentioned, we increase the gas tax. People start to think about how to buy more economical cars, don't buy a car that burns gas. And I know that when you talk about a vehicle miles traveled, the trucking industry today, they can implement that because they have the technology to do it. And I've been told by the trucking industry, if they were to do that, go to that model, it would reduce their calculation. They'd have to go through 3 steps. It would take them down to 2 steps. It would be easier for them. But that's a way for us to test it out there. It can be tested. And then once we figure out how we solve the privacy issues, I believe that most Americans, and it's also a generational thing. My son's 27 years old. When I say people don't want to put a tracking device on their vehicle, he pulls his iPhone out and says, they know exactly where I am. They know exactly what I've purchased. So it's also a generational thing to move towards that. But we really got to, because the left and the right both, I've been in meetings, they say, you're not putting something on my car where you can find out where I am. So it takes time. But I would get always concerned when the bureaucracy is trying to manage this change, and let's do things that makes the market push people into those directions. And
we had one over here, did we?
Yeah, good morning, and thank you very much for this conversation. It really is great. And just to piggyback on what you kind of said earlier was, you know, policy's great, but we first have to kind of figure out the politics of things. And to what Mr. Crowley said about the election cycles, you know, not to discredit anything that you two have done while in office. I think you both did a phenomenal job while in office, but I love this conversation that you're having here. I love the points that you're bringing up, and sometimes it doesn't take some time to kind of like flourish that mindset and flourish with the things that we're working on a policy perspective. So to your point, what are some fixes that we can look at from an election cycle and some of the different ways that we can maybe fix the politics part before we try to implement policy?
I'll just, in Washington, D.C., as Joe mentioned, as I've mentioned, it has to start to get these things to move forward, the leadership. And it's the president, it's the Senate, Republican, Democrat, the House, Republican, and Democrat. They've got to help move this forward. Joe and I could be in Congress and talking all day long, but, you know, CNN, Fox, CBS, NBC aren't going to necessarily cover us. The president gets up and says something to this people. That's right. He does better on media than I do. He's got a face for media. I don't. If Nancy Pelosi or if Kevin McCarthy or if the leaders in the Senate, when they talk about an issue, they get picked up. So they've got to help drive this issue forward. And if they're not willing to do that, then I think we're going to just keep floundering.
I think I've gotten a lot better at making observations since I left office. So, I think that's part of, you know, because what you say, even now, what I say is reported and sometimes skewed in ways which I wasn't intending it to be. But I do think that that's it's unfortunately the way in which we operate. Every state runs its elections differently. Their primaries are different. The only thing that's the same is the same day for general election. And there are a lot of issues that we're grappling with, and not just this particular one, but when it comes to the politics of the House and the Senate, there's a tremendous amount of infighting going on, intra-party discussions. They've had it with the Freedom Caucus, and now we see it happening more on the Democratic side through other entities that are pushing in a very heavy way towards Democrats. So in some respects, you're seeing an even harder pull by both sides, to the right and to the left, for lack of a better term. And I don't know if and when that actually diminishes where people can find solutions. Right now, I think it's difficult to have Democratic members, depending on the district you come from, reaching out to the other side to try to find solutions without being ridiculed. And I think Republicans have had in the past similar situations, maybe diminishing now on their side, but it's really ripening on our side, I think.
One more here.
Just wondering, Mr. Schuster, if you were chairman now, how you would want to manage this process of an infrastructure bill and a surface bill coming due in 2020. What is the correct process? What is the process that you anticipate happening? How do you blend those together?
Well, first of all, I'd be the ranking member. I wouldn't be the chairman because we don't have the majority anymore. But
if you were, though, if you were king of the world,
this problem would be solved. Peter and Richie Neal, they're really two of the key people that have to develop this because it's got to be paid for. And then the policy, they need to be reaching out to members on their side of the aisle and on our side of the aisle, to the stakeholders, to put together what he thinks is possible. What we tried to do on the committee from the very outset was bring the Democrats and the Republicans in the room. Let's talk about it. Let's get the stakeholders. Where's the sweet spot to move it? And so I think Peter's doing that now. I've heard Richie Neal talk about it. So that's really what you have to do, is build that big, broad coalition. And as has been said here, and people say it all the time, it's an issue that Democrats and Republicans want to solve it. We have different ways to solve it, but at the end of the day, moving an infrastructure bill, I think bringing those people together, that's the way to do it.
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you to our two wonderful new chairmen. We're thrilled you're here.
Can I just say it's also great to see Jane Garvey here today as well. She's an incredible administrator, but a great friend throughout the years, so thank you, Jane.
She had to work with Bud Schuster. That's right. So I feel your pain.
So did I.
I feel your pain.
I'm younger than him, but I worked with his father too, so it's like, whoops.
Whoops.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. And that's a good segue to our next panel. So thank you both very much. Thank you. So I'm going to ask everyone to stay seated and call in Jane and Eric and Alex. If you all come on in, and I'll just go ahead and get them.
I know, I saw him standing in the way. I stood up as soon as I saw him. I see it.
Right here. That'd be great. All right. Well, thank you again to the two congressmen. So we have Alex Selesnyov is from KPMG. He's an experienced advisory professional specializing in advisory services for infrastructure finance, alternative project delivery, and public-private partnerships. He has significant experience in the USP3 market internationally across transportation, smart infrastructure, social, water, and wastewater assets. He's going to moderate our discussion with two folks who probably don't need introduction, but we'll do it. Jane Garvey is the chairman of Meridiem Infrastructure, having joined Meridiem in 2009. As many of you know, is the former director of the FAA. Who was in office during 9/11 and saw us through really one of the greatest air crises we've had. And she is joined by Eric Cantor, former House Majority Leader, who is Vice Chairman and Managing Director of Moelis & Company. He's also a member of their Board of Directors, and so they are both members of BPC's Executive Council on Infrastructure. They're going to talk a little bit about the role of the private sector in addressing our transportation needs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel to talk about such an important issue. The prior panel did a great job talking about some of the higher level transportation funding issues. We'll try to focus our discussion a bit more on some of the other ways we can help fix it through perhaps the use of public-private partnerships. So as we've already agreed that infrastructure is a truly bipartisan issue. I think everyone understands that it is a true challenge facing America today. I think some of you might have seen the recent report coming out of the American Society for Civil Engineers assigning grade D+ to the overall state of American infrastructure.
with some of the key assets, including the schools that we talked about, including the roadways and bridges and waterways, getting grades of D and below. Infrastructure is one of the key driving forces behind economic growth. And with the current state of infrastructure, this growth is simply not feasible. So I think we can agree that something needs to be done. We talked about some of the funding challenges and opportunities to resolve these issues going forward. We've heard governors a few weeks ago talk about increasing the gas tax as well. So it seems like this sort of discourse is already taking place. An additional tool in the toolbox, which is by no means a panacea, is public-private partnerships. And the use of P3 has been proven to be effective in delivering projects sometimes much faster than otherwise, and in a way that is more effective and more efficient. So there still remains a lack of understanding around P3s, and which is causing lots of political risk, which we'll get into a bit later. What that means is simply some of the decision makers and policymakers, due to the sometimes lack of knowledge or understanding of some of these P3 mechanisms, they assign a higher level of risk premium to doing P3 projects, and therefore they tend to back away from a P3 approach and revert back to the normal design bid build type of approaches, which sometimes means that projects that need to be done have to wait another 10, 15 years to receive funding before they move off the ground. Additionally, little regard is given, I think this was mentioned by the prior panel as well, Michelle, little regard has been given to the life cycle approach to infrastructure. I think there's been a great focus on building new infrastructure. I think everyone really enjoys cutting ribbons on new projects, but no one cares too much to invest in the ongoing maintenance and operations of existing facilities. And I know a lot of discussions have been had in terms of the financing of these infrastructure assets and projects. But I think, as this distinguished panel will tell you, there's truly not a lack of financing out there. There's plenty of opportunities to get deals financed given the pipeline. With that, let me move over to the Q&A part of our program. Well, the first question is, with all this talk about the huge infrastructure gap and all these trillions of dollars really sitting on the sidelines in the U.S. infrastructure market, private investors still argue that there is just not enough of a pipeline of deals out there. Jane, from your perspective and Meridiem investing in some of these deals, why is that?
Yeah, I think there are probably a number of reasons. First of all, let me say that there are some very successful projects. We're rebuilding LaGuardia now, and that I think has really been a project that offers a lot of great lessons and a great way that the Port Authority approached it. We can talk a little bit more about that. But I think the issue about political risk you talked about, and I think the congressman talked about this as well. State highway departments, transportation agencies are very accustomed to a traditional way of funding. We've always done it. I've been part of infrastructure for many, many years. And when I started in state government, there was a very traditional way to fund the project. So state highway departments, transportation departments are still very accustomed to that. So this is a relatively new model for us in the United States. I frankly think that we in the private sector haven't always done the best job of sort of persuading states why it is a good model. I think it's not enough simply to say, well, we have the money for you. I think talking about innovation, talking about transfer of risk, and what that really means for state government, I think we've probably, the challenge is partly to us to be able to communicate much more why it is an alternative delivery model that's very much worth considering. And again, as everyone has said, not for every project, but for those big, cumbersome, difficult projects where innovation will make a difference, where risk transfer will make a huge difference. If you talk to Pat Foy, who was at the beginning of LaGuardia, he will tell you that was one of the driving forces for him, building an airport, building a terminal rather, over an existing terminal while keeping the existing terminal running and 9 airlines happy was something that he said really he wanted to challenge the private sector to say, how can you do this? And so I think sometimes we in the private sector need to do more to really make the case of why a P3 is a good delivery model to consider.
Would you like to contribute as well?
Sure. It's an honor to be here with Jane and all she did for our country in some very challenging times. And I can tell you, I know you were at Logan Airport somewhere in your career, and you've also had such an impact on our air travel in this country. And as now a person in the private sector on the road almost 300 days a year, I think about you often.
So global services United.
I have all of it. Right. And I also want to just tip my hat to my former colleagues. I mean, just the depth of knowledge that the two of them bring to this discussion, I think bodes very well for their future. And having spoken to both in my post-Capitol Hill life, I know they can provide a lot of good and value to this discussion as we try and cheer on the policymakers here in this town to get something done on this very critical issue of infrastructure. Just briefly, Alex, I do think that there is, as Jane spoke about, a duty upon the private sector to play a bigger role. You know, I'm in an investment bank now, and what we do is we are in the middle between the sort of investors and those who are looking for investment and or capital injections. And specifically in this arena, I have worked alongside some of my partners who've grown up in the infrastructure world. One of our leads started in New York City, and sort of this life cycle concept and the challenges there. And then those on what we call the buy side, and how do you deploy all this liquid capital that's out there. And just to underscore clearly, every conversation that I have with large institutional investors, both here and abroad, and especially those abroad, they want infrastructure investment opportunities here in the U.S. I mean, there's a reason why we still are the destination for global capital, because our system and our rule of law is what it is. But yet we seem to be somehow missing that opportunity when it comes to this asset class of infrastructure. So, you know, I'll just say this. I mean, if you look, and Jane spoke about the state level being the officials being used to a certain conventional way of funding, think about it one level down at the local level. And Bill, I know from a rural area of Pennsylvania, and I can tell you in some of the parts of my state in Virginia, you may look at the P3 project up here in Northern Virginia, but you go 2 hours or less away from that, and there's probably just some basic things that need to be done. I mean, just in terms of asset inventory. If we're going to have a pipeline of projects, that starts with local officials and state, but having sort of an awareness of what kind of assets and infrastructure assets they have, what condition they're in, and what their valuation is. Because then comes in the capital and can then begin the discussion. So again, just one of these sort of examples of what Jane talked about, in that we need to do a better job of spending time and investing that time into bringing local and state officials along.
Thank you very much. Just piggybacking off of that, we have seen tremendous success in P3 market in U.S. With a lot of large mega deals and smaller deals in various asset classes. Can you just talk about what, I know BPC has written about it quite a bit, but from your perspectives, what does success look like in a P3 project, a P3 program on a state and local level? And what lessons can we learn from some of these successes? Perhaps Jane first.
Well, I think, first of all, and I think both of the congressmen really highlighted the importance of leadership. And I know that they spoke about the leadership that needs to happen both from the president and from the Speaker of the House and the Senate and so forth. I think I have never seen a project, whether it's a P3 project or a traditional, just cumbersome big highway project or transportation project, ever succeed without strong local leadership. So every project, when you look around, whether it's P3 or just even the traditional large projects, but particularly P3, have always had some strong leadership, I think, which is why the effort that the BBC is undertaking is going to be so critical and so important, to have good, strong voices out there speaking about infrastructure. So I think that's number one. The second point is clarity around what is the public policy you're trying to achieve. And I think that really gets to Eric's point about understanding your assets, understanding your asset class, because you really have to understand what the public policy is that you're trying to achieve. That's very, very important. Third piece is risk transfer. How much risk do we want to transfer to the private sector? How much do we want to retain? And I think those projects that have succeeded well have articulated that clearly for their constituents. And finally, I would just mention, and there are lots of other reasons, but finally I would say, go back to something again that was said earlier, the importance of communicating what you're trying to achieve. I mean, democracy is a bit messy, and so we're always involving the public, and we're always involving public meetings, but continuing that communication both with elected officials and with local communities as you're going through the process. That hasn't stopped in any successful project I've seen. It continues through the life of the construction. It continues through the life of the operation of the project as well. So those are some lessons. I know there are others.
So I just think it goes back to successful projects, and again, you can look to Virginia, and it's still ongoing, and any of you who commute in from Northern Virginia into this city understand what those so-called hot lanes or express lanes mean and what they've done. And they've sort of adopted sort of the market principles, and some of the controversy, especially around 66, but certainly around 95 as well, has to do with the increase in price at peak times of traffic. And as you know, that pricing is market-based. So whatever the market's going to bear, VDOT's going to charge, again, benefiting both the state as well as Transurban and Fluor, who were the risk takers to go in and provide the bulk of the capital to make that project work. So I agree with everything Jane said. There has to be sort of an alignment of interest as far as what that risk outlook is, and the ability, I think, for the private sector to really commit itself, as well as the public, but to a partnership beyond just the contract. And you know, it's a funny thing. You know, we've both sort of been on the public side, and then now in the private sector, and it's almost two different languages, so to speak. Because there are certainly in the private sector shareholders, investors, and the like that you are held accountable to, but it's a much more straightforward system of accountability in the publicly traded world of the private sector versus when you are in a government position and the constituents basically hold the key to your success if you define that as staying in office. And so that's why I say the commitment to partnership beyond just the contract and understanding that nuance, which is almost a foreign concept when you are in a strict, compared to when you are in a strict commercial environment.
Thank you, Eric. Just mentioning a bit more about I-66 lanes. I know this was raised by the prior panel. So some additional constraints which were put in by VDOT into the contract is a certain throughput rate. So X number of cars per minute need to be traveling on I-66. And the speed is another one. So the overall goals set out by VDOT is to ensure the traffic flow in and out of the district during rush hour, peak periods. Everything else is simple supply and demand economics in terms of what the market can bear on pricing.
There's also, I think, another model that works well with tolls, and that is when you have a managed lane, which will be the second part of 66, which we're involved in outside the Beltway West, 22 miles west. And in that case, there are 2 express lanes, but 3 general purpose lanes. So if you elect to take, you know, be a little slower, that's not as critical an issue, you can still use that lane. If time is of the essence to you, you've got to pick up your kids or whatever, you can use the express lane. So sometimes that option, I think some states have, gone more towards the managed lane concept. Texas has done that in a couple of places because it does provide options. So that's, you know, that's another consideration, I think, for local officials. Maybe that's an option that would work, that would provide that kind of mobility, that express mobility, while at the same time providing the general lanes for others. So.
Thank you, Jen. I think the next question certainly has to be around political risk. As we discussed previously, and you alluded to some of these items in early discussion, politics plays a role in these deals, a tremendous role. And we've seen some potentially very successful projects being derailed due to political machinations before even reaching commercial financial close, which is costing taxpayer money ultimately and is not generally a good outcome. Can you comment as to some of the risk associated with political risk associated with P3s and how can they be overcome? Maybe Eric,
Sure. Well, I think first of all, it is almost a misalignment of time frames, if you will, because elected officials just by definition are going to pay attention to the cycle of elections, whereas an investor comes to the situation with an outlook in terms of a time frame for return on that investment. And so you have a misalignment that you have to address up front, and Jane spoke about communications. Yes, communications to the public at large about what the policy is behind this partnership you're trying to form. And also, I think it's really important to facilitate and demand the flow of information sharing within the partnership itself. Because there is such an overly sensitive mindset as a politician, elected official, that is in some ways so aggravated versus a strict commercial approach that one may take as an investor. So I do think that that can help mitigate the political risk. But there is just inherently in our system, our messy system and loud system of democracy, you know, just the permitting process. We have something called property rights, and we have processes and due process put in place when these kind of projects impact more people. So I know in our infrastructure council that Jane and I serve on, we've worked on a sort of best practices model for the states to try and streamline this so that investors, when they're looking to place their capital, can be somewhat assured that there is a much more of a streamlined process. But I would add to that, you know, we talked about the asset management end of it, of having especially localities enter into this sort of inventory process. But you also might have a capacity issue at the local level for sure. And that is not just sort of all the innovation that exists in the private sector that the private sector knows about, is fluent in, but it's also contracting issues that help give birth to these very complex, you know, P3s. All of that has to go into making there a more robust pipeline for private investors.
Thank you. And again, from a private perspective, Jane?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Eric said. I think particularly the notion of how do you streamline some of the permitting, how do we get that to be, that risk, which is often with the state agencies, how does that factor in, how can that contribute to sort of the investor's interest in it? But I don't think you can ever underestimate the politics of some of these projects. I once I remember a group of engineers that I was working with in to see a member of Congress, and you know, one of the engineers said, "Hey, I don't do politics. I'm an engineer. I don't do politics." And I think the congressman rightly said, "Are you married? Because if you're married, you do politics, right?" So I've often thought of that. It is involved in every deal. I think very often, though, if the project is part of a network, again, back to understanding your assets, if it's a critical piece of a network, it transcends, in a way, the politics, so that it will go from one administration to another. You're not picking something that doesn't mean a lot to a community. You're choosing a project, or a project is moving forward that really is a critical piece of an infrastructure network. And I think that sometimes is a factor, too, for a successful P3.
Thank you. And Eric alluded to a fact which was an interesting one and very nuanced. P3s are very complex instruments, and project agreements, as some of you know, can be thousands of pages thick. Do state and local governments wishing to engage in P3s, do they have the right capacity and do they have the right capabilities in-house to do some of contracting, right? And if not, how can we help them obtain some of these tools and resources?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the, this could be a softball for you guys, but one of the things we always say when we're meeting with states is, you've got to get some outside financial help. You've got to get the right kind of lawyers on this, because it really is a complicated process, and you want to make sure that from the very beginning the RFP is set up correctly and so forth. So I think bringing in outside advisors, and most states do that, I think is really a critical beginning. Some of the work, I think, too, that the BBC has done around, as Eric said, some of the case studies, some of the model legislation around P3, I think all of those tools are really very, very helpful for the private sector, and also, by the way, for the public sector, but also for the private sector as well.
Couldn't agree more.
And I can just brag on on the Commonwealth of Virginia too. I mean, Virginia has set up a special office that's sort of dedicated to P3s and to really focus on innovation and how they can bring up the entire Commonwealth to introduce them to this. Because I do think as we go forward and the infrastructure continues to age, and if we're concerned about people in urban areas and rural areas, we're going to have to really focus in different ways on those two destinations, because the rural areas are the ones that tend to have a less robust tax base. It's threatened with erosion all the time. And in many cases, I know in one of the cases that our council cited was there was a locality in South Dakota that had reached its peak in terms of its borrowing capacity. But it had a really aging water system and needed to make sure that that was addressed in order to maintain that quality of life for its citizens. Well, what happens is you come in and the private sector is willing to enter into discussions and to provide its financial wherewithal so that the town can take advantage of that and leverage off of that. And so I believe, and I know that the folks that I work with at my firm at Moelis & Company, we really believe that this is going to be increasingly a tool at the smaller, medium-sized communities across the country as they reach the top of their borrowing capacity and need some of that, as well as the expertise that can be lent.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one last one. And this one I'd like to ask about a concept which was referenced earlier as well, that is asset recycling. That is a tool that has been pioneered in Australia and successfully used in various jurisdictions in order to monetize existing assets in order to pay for a new asset. Do you think it's a viable concept in the U.S.? And if so, where could it be applied?
Well, I know Eric has really been one of the leaders in this, and his company has been, so I'm going to defer to him for starting.
Look, it's a great concept, and as you know, this is a concept that came from Australia, and the Australian ambassador, Joe Hockey, who is here in Washington, was the sponsor of that legislation, both at the state level and in the national level at Canberra in Australia. And it is a true partnership model. It is a partnership model between the federal government and the state, because there is incentive grants from the federal government for the states and localities to take their infrastructure assets, to monetize those assets, and to dangle a matching grant if those funds achieved through monetization are then turned back over into another infrastructure investment. It's a great ecosystem that I believe strongly should be stressed and prioritized here in Washington.
And I think the key is, as Eric just said, reinvesting in infrastructure. That's really becomes the key for a program like that.
Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions now.
I actually had a question for Jane about what's going on right now with the FAA and the conversations about whether their certification process of the Boeing jets was proper. If you were administrator right now, how would you be, or how do you recommend that they go about kind of reviewing their process for certifications?
Well, I think you've really highlighted exactly what they should do, and I believe they are doing, which is, first of all, ground the planes, and then really a very careful analysis involving NTSB, involving the FAA inspectors, and really examining that very, very carefully. I mean, I think the scrutiny that will be required over the next several weeks and perhaps months is going to be pretty intense. Congress has certainly raised a number of questions, as have various arms of the the government. But I'm certainly, knowing the inspectors and the people at the FAA, I think that whole notion of just focusing and making sure that we're doing this right, there will be the scrutiny, and I think they will give it every examination that's important. I do think there is an important program that I hope we never lose sight of at the FAA, and it began really in the early 90s, which is one of the ways, because aviation has been so safe for many, many years, it had sort of grabbed all the low-hanging fruit. So how do you identify the trends and the precursors? I think that's really has been a critical question that we've always asked ourselves. And they've brought pilots into this, the airlines into it, so that when they see trends and when they see problems, they are free to report that without fear of retribution. Obviously, if it's criminal, it's very different. But if you see a trend, and that's the way that the aviation community has been able to identify some of the precursors and to improve safety even more. So I hope we don't lose sight of programs like that, because I think they have provided an enormous contribution to aviation safety.
Any more questions? Go ahead.
Hello? Yeah. Have you seen P3s become more or less viable in the recent past, or with different policy changes?
Look, I just know in my state, the awareness level is there. Obviously, there's a third of the population, or maybe a little less, that lives up here in Northern Virginia, and very focused on this very crowded pathway into the nation's capital, and see that, as well as the Beltway, have some relief. Again, it doesn't come without some controversy because of the expense of it, and because, frankly, people were used to being able to access that through HUV ability, even very early in the morning without occupancy ability, and now that's taken away. So there is some consequence. I think overall, an appreciation down at the state capitol in Richmond that private sector funding and this market-based system actually is something that can work in this very crowded metropolitan area up here. And I'm hopeful that we can see, again, I've been beating on this a little bit, we can see this spread to the rural areas, which is going to take a little bit different kind of investment and time. And going back to what Jane's statements were in the beginning, on the part of the private sector to invest that time into bringing communities along.
I think there's a much greater awareness. As Erica said, I think you hear governors talking about it, both parties, in a way that perhaps we didn't hear 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think that's a really positive, a very positive sign. I do think that states are still concerned about their core program, so the importance of the work that the previous panel will be doing in terms of articulating the need for the gas tax, because the core program is probably not something that will ever be sort of a big P3 program. That's the, the bread and butter of transportation, and you have to be able to really fund that. And I think for some states, they've been reluctant to move out on some of the P3s because they're so focused on what's going to happen to my core program. So I think as we address that, the notion of some of the alternative delivery models, performance-based, will be even more embraced.
The market is definitely there. I think there's lots of developers, lots of entities interested in doing deals in the U.S., and the interest is what's been the challenge, the interest from a public side.
Thank you. Most of the discussion has been related to bringing capital to bear through PPPs on major complicated projects. But these are leases, let's say 30-year leases, in addition to the construction development of a project, for the management and operation of the facility. There's some good elements of that. The private sector not talked about very much, but the private sector brings to bear a lot of skills that public agencies with which Jane and I have been involved at the state level don't always have. But there are also negatives, and was struck, actually, there's not been a lot of discussion in this country, but certainly both of you were involved in these projects abroad. There hasn't been very much discussion about the collapse of the bridge in Genoa, and which, granted, there's still a lot of investigation to be done, but one of the criticisms is that the private company which operated that bridge was not maintaining it appropriately because of the profit motive. I think that's going to, it seems to me that as we get into this more, that the ideological, philosophic issues about PPPs are going to become more difficult. And I wonder if either or both of you could comment about that.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I have seen exactly the reporting that you're talking about, which is the whole issue around maintenance. But I think that's why some of the contracts and some of the performance-based discussions that we have is so critical and so different. It's what makes the P3s here, I think, quite different. In Miami, for example, right in the contract, we have a certain amount of time. If there's an accident in the tunnel, we have a certain amount of time, and it's not much, to get that cleared out. And if it's not cleared out, then we are fined. We are penalized for it. So these are performance-based contracts, and the key piece of the performance is what is the maintenance? What is the long-term maintenance? Long Beach Courthouse, for example, we spent a lot of money on the energy system that went into it, the heating and the cooling. We spent much more than we would have if we were going to walk away and not be responsible for maintenance, perhaps, or historically some might have put in something less expensive. But we said we've got to maintain this for 35, longer actually, years. So we've got to make sure that we've got the most energy efficient system in, even though it costs more. So I think there are more incentives in the U.S. through the contracts and the performance standards that are established.
But going back to something you talked about earlier, that assumes the public agency has the capacity to manage the contract, and that's, as you well know, a tremendous, real challenge, I think.
It is a challenge, you're right. You're right. And perhaps as we think about reauthorization, building in some incentives for whatever, it's a little bit like the asset management, building in some incentives for whatever grants are available, whatever funds are available, that, you know, incentives for the states to have strong management systems, an ability to be able to monitor the maintenance that takes place.
I also think you raise a great point on the philosophical / political question about the private sector and the profit motive and how that's juxtaposed with a public asset. And I think, you know, as we have heard and witnessed the hyperbolic language around, you know, the recent announcement by Amazon in New York and in Northern Virginia, and the backlash that occurred in New York, causing, I think, you know, obviously causing Amazon to rethink its decision to pull out, but some of the comments that were made about, well, we're giving away public treasure to a company that's going to locate here, why can't we just route those billions of dollars somewhere else? Well, that was a fallacious thought because there were no billions of dollars without that new employment base there. So I think your question is, how do we go and adjust the discourse? How do you communicate the policy angle to this and try and temper this kind of hyperbolic reaction that inevitably will result? Because people will say, this is our treasure. These are our state or local assets. How can we allow a private sector entity to take advantage of us? And I think that's a real challenge and gets into the communication imperative that Jane talked about, and how leaders are going to have to step up and really understand how to defend and promote these projects.
I think we may have time for one more question in the back.
Hi, I'm Bob Hershey. I'm wondering what is being done to do things online, to have meetings online and get the facts before people and get an economic consensus and get the funders of it in agreement with transparency.
I can't point to any specific example. That's a great point, because whether we are consciously and directly online, everybody's on this. So it is there, and I think you raised a good point about how do you incorporate that into your plan of RFPs, communication, the rest.
And I think with many of them, if you look at a couple of these projects, they are doing that. But it is I think it's very important. You make a good point.
All right, and with that, I want to thank our panelists and our moderator, Alex, for being here today. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And as I said before, follow us on Twitter or on our website to keep up to date with both the work of the Council on P3s and on the gas tax. Thank you all.